She was 48 years old, her hands calloused from gripping the earth so often, and she had only one thing in the world she could call her own: an old tractor with a rusty cab and an engine that coughed like a sick man on frosty mornings. She had been fired from the ranch where she'd worked for 20 years, not with shouting or a scene, but with that cold silence that hurts more than any insult. The silence of an envelope with cash inside and a door closing behind her without a backward glance. And it was with that tractor and that pain that Valentina made the decision everyone called madness, to sell the only tool she had, to buy a farm that no one else wanted. A farm lost among the wilderness and oblivion, where she found inside the collapsed shed something she didn't expect to find, and that would change the course of everything. Comment below where you're reading this story. Write your city and your country, because these stories were made to reach far and wide, and we're happy to know which corners of the world they reach. If this story touches you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Let's begin. In the countryside, in times gone by, stories like this were told around campfires and on gravel roads. Valentina wasn't the type to draw attention to herself. She had spent her entire life in the background, behind her work, behind silence, behind that discretion her mother taught her as a girl, which over the years had become second nature. She was born on a farm in the province, the daughter of a ranch hand and a woman who knew how to turn poverty into something dignified, who mended clothes 3 times before buying new ones, and who said that the land always gave back what you put into it with honesty. Her father died when Valentina was 12. One summer afternoon, an accident with machinery that happened as fast as lightning and left the family homeless overnight. Her mother held on. She sold what little they had, placed the younger children with relatives in town, and sent Valentina to work as a maid on the Garmendia ranch, one of the largest in the area, because Valentina was the oldest and strongest and knew the countryside better than any of her siblings. Valentina arrived at the Garmendias at 13 with a cardboard suitcase. Don Aurelio Garmendia was a ranch hand, fair and rugged like the plants that grow in hard soil, without luxuries, but without cruelty either. Valentina was first assigned kitchen duties, but she would slip away whenever she could to the fields, to the barn, to the corrals, because inside a kitchen the world felt too small for her. Don Aurelio noticed, and instead of scolding her, he gradually gave her more responsibility out in the fields, until, over time, Valentina became the person who knew the most about the land on the entire ranch. She knew about animals. She knew about planting. She knew how to operate machinery. She knew how to read the weather by looking at the sky. And she knew when the earth was dry, in a way that had no name, but that she felt in her bones before the instruments showed it. Don Aurelio died one winter, of old age and in peace, as those who have lived well do. And that's when the trouble began. Don Aurelio had 3 children. Maximo, the eldest, who lived in the city and viewed the farm as a financial asset he didn't understand but wanted to make money from. Renata, the middle child, who had married a businessman and showed up from time to time in city clothes that didn't go with the mud. And the youngest, Julito, who simply never showed up and sent messages from some place no one knew exactly where it was. Maximo took the reins, and Maximo had modern plans that included bigger machines, a reduced workforce, and outsourced contracts with city companies. Valentina didn't fit into that new plan. 20 years of honest work. 20 years of knowing that land better than any of those sons who inherited it without deserving it. And the response was an envelope with her severance pay, calculated down to the last cent by an accountant who had never set foot on a farm in his life. and Maximo's cold statement that the company's situation required restructuring. Valentina took the envelope. She looked at the hands that had worked that land for 2 decades. She looked at the tool shed she knew screw by screw. She looked at the sky over that field she could read better than a book. And she said nothing, because she had learned from a young age that true pain doesn't scream. It stays silent and looks for the way forward. The only thing Valentina had outside of work was the tractor. An old Fiat she'd bought on credit many years ago with money saved through countless hardships, paid off in installments, maintained with her own hands, repaired in the shed with parts she found at junkyards, and installed herself because she couldn't afford a mechanic. It was a tired but living machine, just like her, and it was the only thing in the world that truly belonged to her. With the money from her severance pay and the price she managed to get for the tractor, Valentina had only one option: to buy something. Not much. Not something people would consider valuable, but something that belonged to her and no one else. The farm appeared on a piece of paper taped to the wall of the town hardware store. Handwritten in a ballpoint pen that was running out of ink, it said that a 20-hectare property was for sale along the dirt road leading west, complete with a standing house, a shed, and a watering hole. The price was so low that Valentina read it twice, thinking there must be a mistake. There was no mistake. The farm had been abandoned for 5 years since its owner, an old man named Don Ernesto Pallavicino, had died without leaving any direct heirs. The nephews who showed up at the funeral took whatever was easy to take: some good tools, the Jeep that still ran, the new refrigerator, and they left the property in the hands of time, which is the worst steward there is. Valentina went to see it one Tuesday morning, with the autumn chill stinging her face and the countryside still damp from the early morning dew. She walked along the gravel road until she came upon sections where the wires had fallen, the tall grass that had taken over the edges, and the rusty metal gate that creaked with the sound of something that hadn't been opened in years when Valentina pushed it. The house was made of brick, with a tin roof that had a dent in the right side. The windows were boarded up with wood nailed from the inside. The yard was a mix of weeds and dry earth, with a few old trees that had managed to survive on their own. The shed in the back, a large tin shed that had been used to store machinery, was locked with a chain. Valentina walked across the entire property, taking in with her eyes what words could not convey. She saw that the soil was dark and deep beneath the weeds. She saw that the fences, though fallen, had sturdy posts that would hold. She saw that the water trough was a concrete cistern that was still standing, with a lid, clean inside as far as she could tell when she opened it. She saw that the old trees were an ombu, 2 eucalyptus trees, and a huge paradise tree that cast shade at 3 different points on the property. And she saw, through the crack in the locked shed, a shadow moving. Valentina stopped. She looked more closely. The shadow moved again, clumsily, with a stumble that wasn't that of a full-grown animal. And from inside the locked shed came a sound that made her skin crawl. A faint, thin whinny. The whinny of something very small and very new to the world. She pried open the chain with a pipe she found on the ground. The shed smelled of damp earth and old hay. The little light coming through the holes in the metal sheet painted stripes on the dusty floor. And in the far corner, standing on 4 legs that didn't quite know how to work together yet, with its dark coat clinging with moisture, and its large, wide-open eyes looking at Valentina with that mix of fear and curiosity that only those who have just arrived in the world possess, was a newborn foal. Alone. Without a mother. Without anyone. Valentina stood at the barn door, unable to move for a time she couldn't measure. The foal looked at her. She looked at him, and between the two of them, in that old, dark barn, something happened that had no name, but that struck Valentina right in the center of her chest, like something she had known before. They were both alone. They had both just lost the ground they lived on. They were both standing on legs that didn't yet know quite where to go. Valentina walked slowly toward the foal with her hand outstretched, without speaking, without making any sudden movements. The animal took 2 steps back and stumbled with the clumsiness of a newborn. Valentina stopped, crouched down, and waited. And after a moment that lasted as long as things worth waiting for do, the foal stretched out its muzzle and touched the palm of Valentina's hand with its soft lips. Valentina felt the warmth of that muzzle against her skin and knew with a certainty that needs no explanation that she was going to buy that farm even if it left her penniless. She signed the papers 3 days later. The town notary, a man with a bow tie and thick glasses named Ferreira, looked at her over his glasses when he read the amount and asked if she was sure. Valentina said yes with the calm voice of someone who had stopped doubting. There was little left over, just enough to buy the basics: flour, yerba, pasta, sugar, salt, oil, 2 bags of alfalfa for the colt, a flashlight with batteries, a gas heater with a tank, a folded sheet in her bag, and the thermos that always accompanied her in the countryside, made of stainless steel with the logo of a company that no longer existed. She arrived at the farm on Friday at noon, on the only bus that passed by that road, the one that made the run to the neighboring town, and stopped at the crossroads if you asked. She got off with the 2 shopping bags and her purse slung over her shoulder, pushed open the metal gate she already knew, and walked to the shed before entering the house. The colt was in the same corner. When he saw Valentina come in, his legs straightened and his muzzle lifted, searching for something. Valentina opened one of the alfalfa bags, took out a handful, and spread it out with her hand. The colt came over to eat the hay with that clumsy, desperate voracity that hunger has when it still doesn't know how to hide itself. Valentina let him eat. She ran her hand along his back as he chewed. His coat was dirty and matted, but beneath it she could feel the living warmth of a creature that wanted to exist despite everything. That first night, she slept in the house with the back door propped open with a chair because the lock didn't work. She lay down on the old mattress in the only room there was, covered with the sheet over her clothes because the autumn chill seeped easily through the cracks in the windows. She listened to the sounds of the countryside settling in for the night: the crickets, the wind in the eucalyptus trees, the distant hooting of some nocturnal bird. And from the barn, every now and then, came the sound of the foal moving across the dirt floor on its still unsteady legs. Valentina put her hands behind her head and stared at the dark ceiling. She thought of the tractor, of the engine that coughed, of the mornings when she'd start it by hand, pulling the starter until the engine caught on the 2nd or 3rd try. She thought that tractor would have come in handy here, that without it, everything was going to be harder and slower. And then she thought of the colt, of its big eyes watching her from the corner of the barn, and her regret faded. The first few days were spent taking inventory. Valentina walked the 20 hectares on foot, fresh mud caking her boots, taking in with her eyes what she had and what she lacked. The soil was good, you could tell. The weeds were lush, the kind that grow in soil full of life. There was a low-lying area near the back of the property where the grass was greener and the ground gave way slightly underfoot, a sign that there was moisture beneath even if it hadn't rained in days. Near the southern fence was a patch of native trees that provided shade and could serve as shelter for animals in the summer. The shed was large, but had problems with the roof. 2 sheets of metal hung loosely, and a corner on the left side had caved in, creating an opening large enough for rain and wind to come in. That was where the colt lived, and it was the first thing that needed to be fixed. The house needed cleaning and some minor repairs, but it was solid. The walls were thick, made of well-mixed material. The concrete floor was intact, though dirty. The kitchen had a stone sink with a faucet that didn't have water yet because the cistern pump needed servicing. Valentina jotted everything down in a notebook she bought at the general store at the crossroads. A black-covered notebook she filled with lists, measurements, and estimated budgets using the pencil she chewed on while she thought. First came the foal. A newborn foal without a mother was a full-time job, and Valentina knew this from her years on the ranch. The animal needed feeding every few hours. It needed warmth. It needed movement, so its legs would develop properly. It needed company, because horses are herd animals, and loneliness breaks them down inside just like it does people. Valentina prepared a clean corner for him in the barn with fresh hay. She fed him alfalfa soaked in warm water, because his teeth weren't yet developed enough to chew dry food properly. She took him out for a walk in the yard every afternoon, holding him with a rope that he accepted with less resistance each day. And she stayed by his side longer than necessary, because she liked to watch how the colt was gaining confidence in the world, how the legs that at first buckled on their own began to plant firmly on the ground. She named him on the third day. She thought of it while brushing him with the old brush she found in a box in the shed. She looked him straight in the dark eyes and said the name out loud to see how it sounded. Rumbo. The foal pricked up his ears when he heard the word, as if he recognized it from somewhere, as if he knew it was his. Valentina smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in days. The second week brought the first serious problem. Valentina was trying to check the cistern pump, with her hands stuck in the mechanism up to her elbows, when she heard the sound of a vehicle stopping at the gate. She came out with her hands dirty with grease and saw a white double-cab pickup truck with tinted windows, stopped outside the fence. A man got out. About 50 years old, well-dressed for the countryside, with a jacket too clean for someone visiting a place like this. Short hair, graying at the temples, dark glasses that he didn't take off even though he was in the shade. He walked up to the gate with the stride of someone assessing the value of what he sees as he surveys it. He introduced himself as Marcelo Britos. He said he was a local agricultural producer, that he owned fields in the area, and that he'd heard the Pallavicino farm had changed hands. He said he was surprised he hadn't been notified, that he'd had preliminary conversations with the heirs about a possible purchase, and that certain interests he represented in the area made that property a strategic location. He said all this in a soft voice that was almost friendly, but which concealed the harshness of someone accustomed to getting his way. Valentina listened, her grease-stained hands hanging at her sides. Then she said that the farm had been legally purchased, that the papers had been signed before a notary, and that if he wanted to verify it, the land registry was in town and open to the public. Britos smiled. The smile of men who have money and aren't used to being told no. He said he understood, that there was no problem, that he just wanted to introduce himself as a neighbor and see if there was a chance to discuss the matter in the future, that sometimes situations changed. He said that while looking at the tall weeds, the shed with the loose sheet metal, the house with the windows still boarded up, looking at her, at Valentina, with her dirty hands and work clothes and the farm that seemed like the exact opposite of a sound investment, Valentina said there would be nothing to discuss. Britos nodded with that smile that didn't reach his eyes, got into the pickup truck, and drove off, kicking up dust from the gravel. Valentina stood there watching the dust that took a while to settle, and felt the familiar chill running down her spine when you know something isn't over, that it's barely begun. It was Mrs. Gregoria who appeared without anyone calling her, just as important people appear at the moments when they're needed. It was Thursday morning, and Valentina was on the shed's roof, kneeling on the metal sheets, trying to secure the loose one with a hammer and roofing nails, when she heard the voice coming from the gate, with the ease of someone entering a place they know. "Is anyone there?" the voice said. And then, without waiting for an answer, "Of course there's someone here. You can see the smoke from the heater from the road." Valentina climbed down from the roof carefully. A woman was standing in the yard. In her 70s, her white hair pulled back into a braid that wound twice around her head, like a country wreath. She wore a long skirt, a thick, dark wool jacket, and brown rubber boots. She was carrying a basket with a cloth draped over it. She introduced herself as Gregoria Salcedo. She said she lived on the farm beyond the southern hill, about 2 kilometers down the dirt road, that she'd seen a light on the farm last week and had waited a few days before coming because she wasn't the type to meddle in others' lives on the first day. Valentina looked at her with the same reserved distrust she used with strangers. Gregoria lifted the cloth from the basket and took out a jar of homemade jam, a piece of cheese wrapped in wax paper, and a bundle of dried herbs tied with string. "Mint, lemon verbena, and burrito," she said, pointing to the herbs. "For the mate and for the cold nights. It feels colder out here in the countryside than it does in town." Valentina didn't know how to refuse without being rude. She motioned for her to come in. They drank mate in the hallway of the house that Valentina had cleaned, but that still smelled of closed-in air. Gregoria prepared the mate herself because she said she liked to do it her way, and Valentina agreed because she didn't have the energy to argue over trivial matters. And during that slow autumn mate, between the bitter yerba and the wind rustling the eucalyptus branches, Valentina found herself recounting, without meaning to, what had happened. The work at the ranch, the tractor sold, the farm bought with what was left. Gregoria listened without interrupting, with that patience of people who have lived long enough to know that important stories need space to unfold on their own. When Valentina finished, Gregoria didn't say any of the things people usually say. She didn't say she'd been brave. She didn't say everything was going to be all right. She just asked if she'd seen the colt in the shed. Valentina looked at her in surprise. Gregoria nodded slowly. "It belonged to Pallavicino," she said. "The mare gave birth and died right away. An infection. Ernesto was already too sick by the end and couldn't do anything. The foal was left there when the nephews cleared everything out. No one wanted him because a foal without a mother is work, and none of them had time for that." Valentina looked toward the barn where she could hear Rumbo moving. "I'm giving him soaked alfalfa," she said, "twice a day." Gregoria nodded again. "That's fine, but in a few weeks, he's going to need more than that." She stood up and walked toward the barn with steps that knew the terrain. Valentina followed. Rumbo was in his corner. When he saw the 2 women enter, he raised his head and stood still. Gregoria looked at him with the eyes of someone who knows what they're seeing. She checked his hooves, looked into his eyes, ran her hand over his belly. "He's skinny, but he's alive," she said. "And he has good conformation. When he grows up, he'll be a serious horse." Valentina felt something in her chest that wasn't just relief. "Do you know about horses?" she asked. Gregoria looked at her with a smile that crinkled her eyes. "Ma'am, I've known everything a farm has to offer. I was widowed at 42 with 3 young children and 8 skinny cows. You learn what you have to learn." She left before sunset, promising to return with something Valentina was missing. something she didn't even know she was missing yet. She returned the next day with 2 bags of cornmeal and a small can of powdered milk. He explained that the foal needed a mixture to gradually replace the mother's milk it hadn't had, that there was a ratio he knew by heart, and that he was going to teach her how to prepare it. They spent the morning together in the farm kitchen, Gregoria dictating and Valentina taking notes in her black-covered notebook with the pencil she chewed on when she thought. And then they went to the barn to give the foal its first feeding, which it took with such urgency that it smeared the bucket with its muzzle and splashed both of them with white. Gregoria let out a laugh that sounded young. Valentina was surprised to find herself laughing too. It was the first real laugh she'd had since the day of the envelope. The weeks that followed took a shape that Valentina molded with the same quiet discipline she'd always had. She got up before sunrise because the countryside waits for no one. First came rumbo, the mixture of milk and damp hay, the check of the colt's body looking for anything that wasn't right, the 20-minute walk holding him by the rope while his legs got used to the ground. Then the rest. The shed that had to be fixed bit by bit, starting with the loose metal sheets on the roof. The fallen fences that Valentina raised on her own with the patience of someone who knows that long work is done one step at a time. The cistern pump that finally gave in on the 3rd try and started working, sending water to the kitchen sink with low but steady pressure that Valentina celebrated alone in the kitchen with a clenched fist. The vegetable garden was something Valentina wanted, but hadn't had time to start yet. Gregoria told her to wait until the property was a little more settled. That shelter came first and food second. That you couldn't do everything at once. Valentina replied that the soil wouldn't wait. Gregoria looked at her and then nodded. You're right. Start with the garden bed near the south wall. That wall gets morning sun and protects from the north wind. You can get something growing there before the winter cold sets in. Valentina started the garden bed that very afternoon. By the end of the first week of work in the garden, the hands that had always been used for machinery were now covered in dirt up to her wrists. But when, on the 10th day, she saw the first lettuce sprouts piercing the soil like little green dots, peeking out to see what was outside, Valentina crouched down and stared at those little leaves for longer than she could explain. It was small. It was almost nothing. But it was hers, grown in her soil through her own labor. And that carried a weight that words could not bear. Rumbo kept growing. The legs that at first buckled on their own now stood firm. The dark coat that had arrived damp and dull gradually took on a sheen that looked different depending on the time of day. In the afternoon, when the low autumn sun hit him from the side, his coat took on a chestnut hue with coppery highlights that made the animal seem made of something more than flesh and bone. She took him for walks across the land every day. At first, with a short lead rope. Later, a longer one. Then, one day that Valentina hadn't planned, but that happened with the naturalness of things that have to happen, she let go of the rope in the open field, and the colt stood still for a second, as if weighing the freedom of that boundless space, and then set off trotting across the field with a gallop that was still more clumsy than elegant, but which held a joy that was visible. Valentina watched him from the fence and felt something in her chest that was beginning to resemble hope. It was Gregoria who told her more about Britos. One afternoon, as they drank mate watching Rumbo gallop, the woman spoke in the low voice of someone who knows what she's saying is important. "That man wants the water," she said. Valentina looked at her. "The watering hole over here," Gregoria continued. "Pallavicino's cistern was one of the deepest in the area. In summer, when the dry fields can't keep up, this cistern never ran dry. Britos has fields on both sides. He's missing the one in the middle to have free access from one end to the other." Valentina looked at the cistern with new eyes. Did Pallavicino ever sell it to him? Never. Ernesto was a man of his word, and he knew full well that land isn't sold under pressure. Britos asked him for it twice in his lifetime. Both times, Ernesto said no. Valentina processed that in silence. "And now he expects me to have less resolve than Pallavicino," she said. Gregoria nodded slowly. "That's what he expects." Valentina watched Rumbo trot across the field, with his mane blowing in the wind, and felt something settle inside her chest, with the solidity of things that have already decided to stay. "Let him keep waiting," she said. Britos returned 3 weeks later. This time he got out of the truck and walked through the gate without asking permission, with 2 men following behind him with the same attitude of those accompanying someone in power. It was early, and Valentina was in the shed changing Rumbo's haybed. The man walked across the property with that same appraising gaze of his eyes sweeping over the vegetable garden, the fence that Valentina had built section by section, and the shed with its repaired roof. The look of someone who expected to find more ruin than he did. He stood in front of Valentina and told her, in that soft voice that hid the threat, that he had done some digging and that the purchase had aspects that could be questioned, that the settlement of an estate like Pallavicino's sometimes left loose ends that the heirs would later claim, that he had contacts in the area who could complicate the situation for anyone whose paperwork wasn't perfectly in order. He said that if she wanted to avoid legal problems, the best solution was a quick and amicable sale, that he would pay a fair price, and that she could move on without any hassle. He said this while looking at Valentina with the confidence of someone accustomed to seeing pressure work. Valentina leaned the rake against the shed wall. She wiped her hands on her work pants, and she replied that the papers were perfectly in order, signed before the town notary Ferreira, and that if he had any doubts, he could go verify it at the registry, which was public and free. Then she added that if he ever set foot on her property again, without her invitation, she would call the town police. Britos looked at her for several seconds without saying a word. Then he left. The 2 men who had come with him lingered for a moment, looking at the land, looking at her, with that look that conveys a message even without words. Valentina waited for them to leave, went to the cistern, drew water with the bucket, washed her face with cold water, and didn't let her hands tremble until she was sure no one could see her. That night, she went to the barn and sat down in the hay next to Rumbo, who greeted her by nuzzling her hand, as he always did. She ran her hand over the animal's neck and told him in a low voice what had happened, not because she believed the colt understood the words, but because she needed to tell someone, and Rumbo was the only one who listened without judging. The colt twitched his ears and continued chewing hay. And that, somehow, was enough. Gregoria showed up the next day, as if she knew. Valentina hadn't told her anything, but the woman walked into the yard with her basket, looked at her, and told her to tell her. Valentina told her. Gregoria listened in silence, her mate in hand. When Valentina finished, the woman said she knew the notary Ferreira and that she was going to send him a message to make sure everything was properly recorded, with no loose ends anyone could use. She also said that Britos was a man who used pressure as a tool, but that when pressure didn't work, he escalated, and that it was better to be prepared before he escalated. Prepared how? Valentina asked. Gregoria looked at her with those eyes that had seen so much. Knowing that you're not alone, she said. That was when Valentina met Don Silvio. He was the owner of the northern ranch, a man in his 60s, a man of few words with a direct gaze, who was in the habit of riding his horse down the road on Tuesday mornings. Valentina had seen him several times from a distance, but they had never exchanged more than a distant greeting. One Tuesday, Don Silvio stopped his horse in front of the gate and asked if he could come in. Valentina motioned that he could. The man dismounted with the agility of someone who's spent his whole life on horseback, tied the animal to the gate post, and walked toward the barn where Valentina was with Rumbo. He stood looking at the colt for a while without saying a word. "He's going to have good conformation," he said after a moment. "His feet are even. His chest is broad. He's going to be a serious workhorse." Valentina nodded. "Are you breaking him in on your own?" asked Don Silvio. "He's still too young for breaking," replied Valentina. "The training comes later." Don Silvio looked at her with newfound attention. "You know horses." "I've learned everything there is to know on a ranch." The man nodded with the slowness of someone who thinks before speaking. "I heard about Britos," he said after a moment. Valentina didn't answer. "Palabricino and I were neighbors for 40 years, Don Silvio continued. "Britos asked him for the land twice in his lifetime. Both times Ernesto told him to get lost. Politely, but he told him to get lost." "He told me the paperwork might have issues," said Valentina. Don Silvio snorted. "Pallavicino's paperwork was perfect. The man was organized. Britos is bluffing. What he's counting on is that you don't know what you have." Valentina processed that. "And what do I have?" she asked. Don Silvio looked at her. "A cistern that never runs dry. 20 hectares of good soil that no one has worked in 5 years, and that will respond like never before when someone puts in the work it deserves. And a colt that, when it finishes growing, will be the best horse in the area." He paused. "You have more than Britos wants you to believe you have." That night, Valentina opened the black-covered notebook and wrote. She wrote down what she had: the cistern, the land, the repaired shed, the growing vegetable garden, the fences put up, the colt. She wrote it all in clear letters, as if she needed to see it to believe it. Then she read it. And for the first time since she signed the papers, she didn't feel the weight of fear crushing everything else. She felt the weight of the things that were worth it. In the weeks that followed, Gregoria came more often. She spent entire afternoons teaching Valentina things with the patience of someone who imparts knowledge without haste. She taught her how to prepare the soil for winter planting. She taught her how to save seeds from one season for the next. She taught her how to make cheese with the milk that Rumbo wouldn't consume all in a single day. She taught her the names of the native plants of the southern forest, and which ones had medicinal uses and which ones were good for the livestock. Valentina absorbed everything with the same attentiveness she always had for learning what she needed to survive. She jotted things down in her notebook. She asked questions when she didn't understand. She repeated things until she got it right. And Don Silvio came by on Tuesdays, and sometimes on Thursdays. At first, under the pretext of checking on the colt. Later, without any excuse, simply stopping at the gate and asking if she needed anything from town, if she could reach a piece of wood, if she'd noticed that the southern fence had a loose section near the woods. One day, he showed up with 2 posts and a roll of wire in the truck bed, saying they were leftovers from a repair job on his land, and he didn't want them to go to waste. Valentina knew they hadn't been left over from any repair job, that he'd bought them on purpose, but she accepted them because Don Silvio's kindness had a way of being offered that didn't put her in his debt, that gave without charging with the gesture, and that was different from everything Valentina knew about how the world works. Rumbo was visibly growing. In 2 months, the transformation was the kind that makes your eyes doubt what they're seeing. The legs that had stumbled now trod the field with a confidence that already promised speed. The body that had been all bone and clinging fur had gained muscle and roundness. His neck had lengthened and arched with that curve that good horses have. And his eyes, which had something special about them from the start, were now the kind of horse eyes that seemed to be thinking. Valentina brushed him every morning and every afternoon. She talked to him while she did it, not because she expected a response, but because the sound of her own voice helped her sort out what was in her head. She told him what she had done that day, what she was going to do the next, what worried her, what gave her hope. And the colt listened, with his ears twitching, turning them toward her like antennas trying to pick up every frequency. It was during one of those afternoon grooming sessions that Valentina heard the engine of Britos's truck on the road. This time he didn't stop at the gate. He drove slowly along the gravel road, as if passing by casually and glancing sideways. But Valentina noticed that a window was halfway open and that someone was looking out from inside. That night she slept little, not out of fear, but out of rage. A cold, orderly rage that didn't need to scream to make itself felt. The summons arrived 10 days later. It was an official envelope, bearing the seal of a law firm in the city. Inside was a document that Valentina read 3 times because she wasn't familiar with legal jargon, but which she eventually understood in essence. Britos had hired legal representation and alleged that the sale of the Pallavicino property had involved irregularities in the probate process that affected the validity of the transfer. It summoned Valentina to appear before a justice of the peace in town in 3 weeks. Valentina left the envelope on the table. She went to the shed. She placed her hand on Rumbo's back. She took a breath. Then she grabbed the black-covered notebook and went to find Gregoria. The woman read the document calmly, sitting in Valentina's kitchen with the glasses she'd taken out of her coat pocket. She read it all the way through. She folded it. She handed it back to her. "Ferreira needs to see this," she said. "Today." The 2 of them went to the town notary that very afternoon. Notary Ferreira was a 70-year-old man who had seen more rural disputes than most judges. He read the document with the same calmness as Gregoria, then took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, which was his way of preparing to say something important. "The purchase is in order," he said. Pallavicino's heirs signed the assignment of rights with all the formalities. There is no irregularity to support what this document claims. What you have is a lawyer who knows how to use delay as leverage. He looked at Valentina. "You have to appear in court, and you have to go with your documents in order. I'll prepare the complete file for you and write a report on the entire chain of events. Britos can try whatever he wants, but on paper everything is in your favor." Valentina nodded. "Do you have money for a lawyer?" asked Ferreira. "No." The notary thought for a moment. "There's a lawyer in town, Claudia Miter, who offers free legal counseling on Wednesdays. Go see her. Tell her everything. With the file I put together for you, she can represent you at no cost." Valentina went to see Dr. Miter the following Wednesday. She was a young woman, around 40, thin and quick-talking, who listened to everything with unwavering attention. She reviewed the documents. She asked precise questions. And in the end, she said the case was clearly in Valentina's favor, and that she would represent her. She looked at Valentina with direct candor. This guy does this to people who can't defend themselves and who are intimidated by the lawyer's role. As soon as he sees you have representation, he'll tone it down. I'm warning you. Valentina left that office with something she hadn't felt in weeks. The certainty that the ground wasn't shifting beneath her feet. What happened next unfolded in a way Valentina hadn't expected and left her speechless. Don Silvio spoke with 2 neighbors in the area, men who owned fields along the road and knew the history between Britos and Pallavicino. Both said they were willing to testify about Valentina's character and the status of the property. A woman who bought vegetables from Valentina at the town market, back when Valentina first started bringing produce from her garden, heard about the situation and went to tell her that she would speak up too if needed. The shopkeeper at the crossroads, where Valentina bought her groceries and always paid on time, said he could sign a statement if necessary. Valentina looked at them all and didn't know what to say, because she hadn't asked them for anything. No one had organized anything. People simply started showing up, one by one, from different directions, because they had seen what she had done on that plot of land and weren't willing to let it be taken away without saying a word. The hearing was held at the town's magistrate's court, a room in the town hall with walls painted sea green and white plastic chairs. Britos arrived with his city lawyer, wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Valentina arrived with Dr. Mitre and the file that Ferreira had prepared, meticulous and complete, as only those who have been doing it well for years can make it. Don Silvio was sitting in the back row. So was Gregoria, in her dark wool jacket, hands folded in her lap. The woman from the market was in the second row. The storekeeper at the crossroads had sent a signed note that Dr. Mitre presented along with the documents. The justice of the peace was a man in his 50s, with gray hair, unassuming. He read everything presented to him with methodical attention. He listened to Britos's lawyer explain the challenge. He listened to Dr. Mitre respond with the documents one by one. He listened to Don Silvio speak for 2 minutes about what he knew of the Pallavicino farm and the current status of the property. He listened to the woman from the market say that Valentina was hardworking and honest, and that it showed. Then he called a recess. When he returned, he got straight to the point. The purchase of the property was valid in all its terms. The challenge had no legal basis. Britos would pay the costs of the proceedings. She added, looking at Britos's lawyer with a firmness that needed no raising of her voice, that the use of the judicial system as a tool to pressure people exercising legitimate rights was a practice the court would not tolerate, and that any further action of that kind would be dealt with the appropriate severity. Britos's lawyer put away his papers without saying a word. Britos left without looking at anyone. Valentina remained seated in the white plastic chair for a moment after the room began to empty. Dr. Mitre squeezed her arm. Gregoria approached and placed her hand on her back. Don Silvio nodded from a distance with that slowness of his that spoke louder than any words. Valentina felt her eyes burning, but she held them back because it wasn't the time or the place. Then she stepped out into the afternoon sun with the papers in her hand, and breathed in the village air, which smelled of earth and a neighbor's barbecue, and thought of Rumbo waiting for her in the shed, and the vegetable garden that would need watering when she arrived, and the fences on the south side that still needed 3 more sections repaired. She thought she had a lot of work ahead of her, and that, for the first time in a long time, she felt exactly as she should. The months that followed grew along with the farm. Valentina sold the first harvests from the garden at the town market: lettuce, Swiss chard, parsley, zucchini. Small amounts at first, but steady, and people began seeking her out because the vegetables had that taste of well-tilled soil that you can tell from the very first bite. With what she saved up, she bought 2 hens that Gregoria brought her from her farm. Then 1 more. Then a rooster. She built the chicken coop all by herself, using wood from the woods and wire mesh, constructing it 1 section at a time in the afternoons after the heavy work. The hens began laying, and the eggs were added to what she sold. One day, without warning, Don Silvio brought 2 skinny goats that he said had wandered loose from a neighboring field and that no one was claiming. Valentina accepted them, knowing he had gotten them on purpose, but without telling her, because that was his way of helping without it seeming like help. The goats began to give milk, and Valentina learned from Gregoria how to make white cheese, which she later learned to age, and the cheese was added to the market basket. Rumbo grew up with all of that around him, in a field that was gradually coming to life. He grazed on the back acres that Valentina had fenced off for him. He came to the barn only when he wanted to, which was almost always at dusk, when the cold set in, and he sought the warmth of the enclosed space and the fresh hay that Valentina left for him. The training came when it came, slowly and with respect, as things are done with animals that trust. Valentina didn't rush any step. She followed the colt's pace, not her own. First the long rope, then the muzzle, then the weight of her hand on his back, resting there patiently, until the animal's body stopped tensing at that touch. Then the blanket. Then the light saddle. Each step a week of patience. Each step confirmed before moving on to the next. Don Silvio came on Tuesdays and stayed to watch. He never gave instructions unless asked. But when Valentina asked him, he answered with the precision of someone who has known horses since before he could read. The first time Valentina climbed onto Rumbo, the colt stood still. Only his ears twitched, searching for the presence of that person on top of him, processing the newness. Valentina didn't rush him. She let him process it. Let him feel the weight without movement. And when the animal's body relaxed beneath her, Valentina placed her hands on his mane and whispered his name, Rumbo. The horse moved. One step, another. Valentina didn't guide him. She let him choose. And Rumbo chose to walk toward the open field in the same direction he always took when he went out alone, as if he knew that what was worthwhile lay out there. Don Silvio, leaning against the fence, watched the scene in silence. When Valentina returned and dismounted, the man nodded his head just once. But there was something in that gesture that Valentina kept in the place where things that matter are kept. One summer afternoon, with the fields green from the first heat of the season and the cistern full from the November rains, Don Silvio stayed later than usual. They were sitting on the porch of the house drinking mate, watching Rumbo graze in the field behind the house, with the calm of an animal that knows the place where it stands is its own. Don Silvio swirled the bombilla in his mate for a moment before speaking. He said that since his wife died 7 years ago, he hadn't found anyone else with whom he wanted to share mate time without the silence weighing on him. He said he had come on Tuesdays because Valentina's farm needed a hand. That was true, but that he had kept coming because he, too, needed something he couldn't quite name until he found it. He said no more. He didn't have the vocabulary for more, nor did he need it. Valentina listened to him with her hands on the mate. She thought of the 20 years of silence at the Garmendia ranch, of the envelope with the final pay, of the sold tractor, of the rusty pipe gate that creaked the first time she pushed it, of the colt in the corner of the barn, looking at her with those eyes that still knew nothing of the world. She thought that life sometimes lays out paths in a way that no one would plan, but that when you travel them from start to finish, they make sense. She handed him the mate. Don Silvio took it, and the two of them stood gazing at the field in silence, while Rumbo grazed peacefully on that summer afternoon, with the sun sinking behind the eucalyptus trees and the long shadow stretching across the field from end to end, as if the whole world were in order. It was a year after arriving at that farm that Valentina was cleaning the shed one Sunday afternoon when she heard the sound of a vehicle at the gate. It wasn't Don Silvio's pickup truck, which she already recognized by sound. It was an older model, with an engine that made a distinctive belt-like noise. She went to the front and saw a man in his 40s standing at the gate, thin, hat in hand, his face worn from several days of fatigue. He had a small suitcase at his feet, and the demeanor of someone who had reached the end of something and didn't know if what he had found was the beginning of something else. He asked if this was the farm of the woman who had transformed the land that everyone said was beyond repair. Valentina looked at him. "What do you need?" she asked. The man said he was a retired veterinarian who had worked for 30 years at a veterinary lab in the city until the company closed and laid him off. He had family in the neighboring town, but they had no room for him. He'd heard at the market that there was a horse being broken in on this farm and that the owner, they said, was a woman who knew the countryside but might need someone with veterinary knowledge. Valentina looked at him for a moment. She thought of the colt that had arrived alone at the barn, of herself, who had arrived alone at this farm with calloused hands and the tractor sold, of Gregoria with the basket, of Don Silvio with the posts and the wire. She thought that places with life always find a way to attract more life to them. She opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "There's mate, and there's work for anyone who wants it." "Oh!" The man entered with the suitcase in his hand and stopped when he saw Rumbo approaching from the field, his mane blowing in the afternoon breeze and that trot that already had the elegance of a trained horse. He stood there watching him with the eyes of someone who understands animals. "A fine specimen," he said in a low voice. "He arrived as a newborn, all alone," said Valentina, "like everyone who ended up amounting to something on this farm." The man looked at her, and then he looked at the farm, the tidy barn, the green vegetable garden, the chickens in the coop, the goats in the eastern pasture, the house with fresh paint on the facade, the straight fences, the cistern with its clean lid. He looked at all that, and something in his face began to change little by little, like someone who had been waiting for something and finally found it where he least expected it. Rumbo stopped in front of Valentina and sought out her hand with his muzzle, as he always did, with that habit they had built together from the very first day in the dark shed. Valentina ran her hand over the horse's neck and felt the warmth of that animal who had come into the world alone and skinny in a corner of neglect, and who was now the liveliest horse in the area. She thought of the tractor, of the engine that coughed, of the severance pay envelope, and she thought that if she had known from the start, she would have sold it sooner. There are people who, when they lose what they had, just stare at the void it left behind. Valentina looked ahead and saw what she could sow. She had no luck, no inheritance, and no easy path. She had the stubbornness of someone who refuses to let the end of a chapter be the end of the story. She had hands that knew the earth and machinery and that learned what they needed to learn. She had the humility to accept the help that came without her asking for it. And she had a colt that chose her in the corner of a barn when both were afraid and didn't know where to go. The truth is, no one rebuilds themselves alone, even if they start alone. And perhaps the most important thing this story leaves us with is this, that abandoned places need people who believe life can sprout there. And that people who were abandoned need a place to prove they still have everything necessary to make something grow. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that starting from scratch isn't failing. It's the only beginning worth having. And subscribe to the channel because every week there's a new story waiting for you.